A millionaire cowboy hears townspeople laugh at a widow's daughter's worn dress.
It is certainly no fabric for a farm girl. Though, looking at you, child, I suppose any fabric at all would be an improvement.
Then, quietly makes a move that would leave the entire town speechless. The bitter winter wind stripped the trees bare, but the truest chill lingered inside the quiet town mercantile. 10-year-old Nellie stared at her boots. She wished the frayed hem of her oversized, faded gray dress would simply swallow her whole. Then came the laughter.
Really, Harriet, it looks as though she's wearing a potato sack left out in the rain.
Nellie, sweetheart, don't mind them. Let's go home.
It was polite, mocking, and cruel, echoing from the wealthy women gathered by the counter. They assumed their arrogance would go completely unchecked. They were wrong. Standing quietly in the shadows was Josiah Langdon, a millionaire cattleman. He heard them laugh at the widow's daughter's old dress. Josiah didn't raise his voice or make a scene, but his very next move would silence everyone in that frontier town. Winter arrived in Clearwater with a bitter wind that stripped the elm trees bare. It was November of 1883. The cold seeped through the wooden floorboards of the town mercantile and settled deep into the bones of anyone who lingered. The sudden laughter cut through the quiet store, sharp enough to freeze the blood of the richest man listening. Cora Thornton stood near the counter, counting small coins into her palm. She was a widow. Her hands were red from washing clothes in freezing water, and her back ached from carrying firewood. Beside her stood her daughter, Nellie. Nellie was 10 years old. She had bright blonde hair that fell in thick, neat braids down her back. She was a quiet girl. She had learned to be quiet the day her father did not come home from the lumber camp. Nellie was wearing a gray woolen dress. It was not her dress. It had belonged to a neighbor's older girl 3 years ago. The wool was thinning at the elbows. The hem had been taken up, then let down again, leaving a faint, jagged line of darker gray near her ankles. The collar was fastened with a mismatched iron button. Cora knew the dress was poor. Nellie knew it, too, but they did not complain. They were Thorntons. Nellie's grandfather had been Colonel Silas Thornton. During the Civil War, the colonel had led the legendary midnight charge at Antietam. He had taken 100 men through the dark to secure the vital stone bridge, holding off an entire battalion until dawn. He was a hero. The town had built a small wooden plaque near the bank in his honor. But bronze plaques and Old Glory did not buy flour. They did not patch a leaking roof. When the colonel died 5 years ago, he left behind a proud name and a heavily mortgaged farm. Cora's husband had tried to save it. When he passed, the weight of the dirt and the debt fell entirely on Cora. She placed her coins on the glass counter. "Half a sack of oats, Mr. Higgins," Cora said softly, "and a tin of lard." Mr. Higgins, the storekeeper, nodded. He was a decent man, but business was business. He swept the coins into his till. Nellie stood near the fabric display. Her blue eyes were fixed on a bolt of bright red flannel. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It looked warm. It looked like Christmas. She reached out one cold, bare hand and let her fingers hover just an inch above the soft cloth. She did not touch it. Her mother had taught her never to handle things they could not afford to buy. Behind her, the mercantile door opened. A rush of cold wind swept into the room, followed by the rustle of heavy silk. Mrs. Harriet Gable and Mrs. Eunice Croft walked in. They were the wives of the town's two most prosperous merchants. They wore thick fur collars. Their hats were pinned with dyed feathers. Nellie took a step back, making room for them. Mrs. Gable brushed past. She stopped at the fabric counter. She noticed the red flannel. Then, she noticed the little blonde girl standing near it. Her eyes moved down. They swept over Nellie's mismatched button. They lingered on the worn elbows. They stopped at the jagged, faded hem of the oversized gray dress. Mrs. Gable smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Beautiful fabric, isn't it?" Mrs. Gable said. Nellie looked up. "Yes, ma'am. It's imported," Mrs. Croft added, stepping closer. $4 a yard. I'm having a winter coat made of it for my niece." Nellie nodded politely. She pulled her hands behind her back. Mrs. Gable let out a low, breathless chuckle. "It is certainly no fabric for a farm girl. Though, looking at you, child, I suppose any fabric at all would be an improvement." Mrs. Croft covered her mouth. She let out a sharp, piercing laugh. The sound echoed off the tin ceiling. "Really, Harriet," Mrs. Croft whispered, though not quietly enough. It looks as though she's wearing a potato sack left out in the rain. You would think the granddaughter of a war hero would have a shred of dignity. Pride doesn't keep you warm, Eunice, Mrs. Gable replied. But neither does that dreadful garment. They laughed again. Nellie did not cry. She simply lowered her head. Her shoulders tightened. She stared at the floorboards, wishing the wood would open up and hide her. At the counter, Cora stiffened. Her hands gripped the edge of the wood. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She took a slow, deep breath, swallowing the sharp retort that burned in her throat. She could not afford to anger the wives of the men who bought her eggs and milk. Nellie, Cora said. Her voice was steady, but it carried a slight tremble. Come here, please. Nellie hurried to her mother's side. We are leaving, Cora said. She picked up her small sack of oats. She took Nellie's hand. They walked past the two women without looking up, pushing through the heavy mercantile doors and stepping out into the freezing wind. They did not notice the tall man standing just inside the entryway. Josiah Langdon had just stepped out of the shadows near the stove. He was a cattleman. He owned the sprawling Broken Ridge Ranch, 20 miles out of town. He employed 40 men. He shipped cattle on the new railroad all the way to Chicago. He was, by every measure, a millionaire. But he did not dress like one. He wore a faded canvas coat, heavy leather chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with trail dirt. Josiah had heard every word. He had seen the little blonde girl looking at the red flannel. He had seen the way the women looked at her. He had heard the laughter. Josiah knew that sound. He had a daughter of his own. Her name was Eliza. She was 9 years old. Since Josiah's wife passed away, Eliza was his entire world. If anyone ever looked at his Eliza the way those women had just looked at the Thornton girl, Josiah knew he would have torn the store apart with his bare hands. But Cora Thornton had not shouted. She had simply absorbed the blow to protect her daughter. Josiah watched the widow and the little girl disappear down the frozen, rutted street. He slowly turned his head and looked at Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Croft. They were still chuckling, admiring the red flannel. Josiah walked up to the fabric counter. His boots struck the floorboards with heavy, deliberate thuds. The sound was loud enough to make both women turn around. Mrs. Gable's smile faltered. She recognized him. Everyone in Clearwater recognized Josiah Langdon. Mr. Langdon, Mrs. Gable said, smoothing her silk skirt. A cold morning, isn't it? Josiah did not smile. He looked at the red flannel. Then he looked at Mrs. Gable. Mr. Higgins, Josiah called out. His voice was deep. It rumbled like distant thunder. The storekeeper hurried over. Yes, Mr. Langdon? What can I do for you? Josiah pointed a thick, leather-gloved finger at the red flannel. How many yards do you have on that bolt? About 40 yards, sir, Mr. Higgins said. I'll take it, Josiah said. Mrs. Gable blinked. All of it. But Mr. Langdon, I was just about to purchase 5 yards for my niece. Josiah finally looked directly into Mrs. Gable's eyes. His gaze was entirely flat. It lacked any warmth. You were, Josiah said, but you were too busy laughing to open your purse. Mrs. Gable's face flushed a deep, mottled red. Josiah pulled a thick roll of greenbacks from his coat pocket. He peeled off several bills and dropped them onto the counter. Wrap the whole bolt, Mr. Higgins, Josiah said softly, and load it into my wagon. Josiah turned and walked out the door, leaving the mercantile in absolute silence. He stepped out into the cold. He looked down the street. He could still see Cora and Nellie walking in the distance, their heads bowed against the wind. Josiah did not follow them immediately. He was not a man who acted recklessly. He was a man who planned. He untied his horse from the hitching post. He had come to town to sign a contract at the bank. But as he mounted his horse, he realized the contract no longer mattered. Something else required his attention. The Clearwater Bank sat at the end of the street, built of red brick and thick glass. It was the warmest building in town. Josiah Langdon pushed open the heavy oak doors. The warmth washed over him, smelling of pipe tobacco and polished wood. Behind the main desk sat Mr. Arthur Gable. He was a man who preferred ledgers to people. He was also the husband of Harriet Gable. Mr. Gable looked up from his papers. His polite, practiced smile appeared instantly. Mr. Langdon, Gable said, standing. I have the grazing contract ready for your signature. Josiah walked to the desk. He did not sit down. I am not here for my contracts, Josiah said. Gable's smile slipped just a fraction. Is there a problem with the terms? No. Josiah rested his large, calloused hands on the polished mahogany. "I want to see the Thornton note." The bank manager froze. The silence in the room stretched. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly. "The Thornton note?" Gable repeated. His voice had lost its confident rhythm. "I am afraid I cannot discuss another customer's private accounts, Mr. Langdon. It is a matter of bank policy." Josiah stared at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply let the weight of his presence fill the space between them. Josiah was a man who controlled half the economy of the county. Policy was a word smaller men used to hide behind. "Show me the ledger, Arthur," Josiah said softly. Gable swallowed hard. He opened a heavy drawer. He pulled out a leather-bound book and turned the thick pages. He slid the book across the desk. Josiah looked at the numbers. The original loan had been for $200. It had been taken out by Cora's late husband to buy seed and repair the barn. But the balance at the bottom of the page was nearly $450. Josiah's eyes narrowed. He traced a finger down the column of ink. "What are these charges?" Josiah asked. "Standard interest," Gable said quickly. "And these?" "Late penalties." Gable shifted his weight. "Mrs. Thornton has missed the full payment amount 3 times. The bank must protect its investments. She missed the payment by $3, Josiah read. "And you added a $20 penalty. It is standard practice." "For a widow?" Gable stiffened. "The bank cannot afford to be sentimental, Mr. Langdon. If a property cannot sustain itself, the bank must take it back." Josiah closed the ledger. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. He understood now. This was not about a $3 shortage. This was about the farm. The Thornton property sat on a prime section of the valley, right where the new county road was planned to cross. Arthur Gable did not want Cora's money. He wanted her land. And his wife was laughing at her daughter in the mercantile while he quietly stole their home. Josiah reached into his coat. He pulled out the same thick roll of greenbacks. He counted out $450 and dropped the bills onto the ledger. "The debt is paid," Josiah said. Gable stared at the money. "Mr. Langdon, you cannot simply—" "I just did. This is highly irregular. Write the receipt, Arthur." Gable picked up his pen. His hand shook slightly as he wrote out the confirmation. He stamped it and handed the paper across the desk. Josiah folded it and placed it in his pocket. Before he turned away, Josiah leaned closer to the banker. "If I ever hear of you adding false penalties to a working family's account again," Josiah said, his voice a low rumble, "I will pull every dollar of the Broken Ridge accounts out of your vault. And I will tell every rancher in this valley to do the same." Gable turned completely pale. Josiah walked out of the bank. The cold air felt cleaner than the air inside. He climbed into his wagon. He looked at the heavy bolt of red flannel resting in the back. He snapped the reins. He steered the horses out of town, taking the snow-dusted road toward the valley. 2 miles outside of town, the Thornton farmhouse sat against a line of dark pines. It was a small, square building. The paint had chipped away from the siding. The front porch sagged on the left side. But the yard was neatly swept, and firewood was stacked in careful, straight lines against the wall. Inside, the house was chilly. Cora sat at the kitchen table. Her sewing box was open. Nellie's gray dress lay across Cora's lap. Cora was trying to mend the frayed hem with black thread because she had run out of gray. Nellie sat on the braided rug near the small iron stove. She was reading a school book. "Ma," Nellie asked quietly. "Yes, sweetie. Did Grandpa Silas really hold the bridge all by himself?" Cora stopped sewing. She looked up at the stone mantel above the fireplace. Resting on the mantel was a wooden box. Inside lay an old cavalry medal and a faded piece of parchment. "No," Cora said softly. "He wasn't by himself. He had good men with him." Nellie turned a page in her book. "Mrs. Gable said pride doesn't keep you warm." Cora felt a sudden ache in her chest. She hated that her daughter had heard those words. She hated that she could not wrap Nellie in something beautiful and bright to shield her from the cruelty of the town. "Mrs. Gable is right about that," Cora said. She tied off a knot in the thread and bit the end clean. "But she is wrong about everything else." Nellie looked at her mother. "What do you mean?" "Pride doesn't keep you warm," Cora explained, her voice steady. "But dignity keeps you standing. A person can have cold hands and still have a strong spine. Do you understand?" Nellie thought about it. She nodded slowly. "I don't mind the dress, Ma," Nellie said. It was a lie. They both knew it. But it was a brave lie, offered out of love. Cora smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was genuine. Before she could speak, a dog barked outside. Cora stood up. She looked through the frosted window. A heavy wagon pulled by two dark horses was rolling into their yard. Cora felt a sudden spike of fear. Wagons usually meant the bank, or the tax collector. She opened the front door. The bitter wind rushed in. Josiah Langdon pulled back on the reins. The wagon came to a halt. Beside Josiah sat a little girl. She was 9 years old. She wore a thick wool coat and a blue knitted cap. Her dark hair escaped in curls around her face. This was Eliza Langdon. Josiah climbed down. He helped Eliza to the ground. Then, he reached into the back of the wagon and lifted the massive bolt of red flannel. Cora stepped onto the porch. She pulled her thin shawl tight across her shoulders. "Mr. Langdon," Cora said, her voice guarded. She knew who he was. "Mrs. Thornton," Josiah said, removing his hat despite the cold. "I apologize for the intrusion. Has one of my cows broken your fence line?" "No, ma'am. Your animals are right where they belong." Josiah walked toward the porch. He carried the heavy fabric easily. Eliza walked beside him. She looked up at Cora, then peeked past her at Nellie, who had come to stand in the doorway. "I was at the mercantile this morning," Josiah said. Cora's expression closed immediately. Her posture stiffened. She prepared herself for pity. "If you have come to offer charity, Mr. Langdon, you can turn your wagon around," Cora said firmly. "We manage our own affairs." Josiah stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. "I am not a man who gives charity, Mrs. Thornton. I am a man who makes investments." Cora frowned. "Investments?" Josiah looked down at the red flannel. Then he looked back at Cora. "I heard the conversation in the store," Josiah said quietly. "I heard what was said to your daughter." Nellie shrank back a little. Josiah looked directly at the little blonde girl. His eyes were kind. "I bought this fabric," Josiah continued, "because I refused to let Harriet Gable have it. But I have no use for 40 yards of flannel. My ranch hands don't want it, and my daughter says red is not her color." Eliza nodded solemnly. "It clashes with my boots." Josiah looked back at Cora. "I need someone to turn this into winter shirts for my men," Josiah said. "I hear you are the finest seamstress this side of the ridge. I would like to hire you, at fair wages." Cora stared at him. She looked at the vibrant, beautiful cloth. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was offering her money without offering her shame. "And," Josiah added, his voice dropping slightly, "I would ask that you use the first few yards to make a dress for your daughter. Consider it a signing bonus." Cora's breath hitched. She looked at Nellie. Nellie was staring at the red fabric. Her blue eyes were wide. She looked as if she were looking at a fire on a freezing night. "Why are you doing this?" Cora asked softly. Josiah looked at his own daughter, who was now smiling at Nellie. "Because a town that laughs at a child," Josiah said, "is a town that needs to be reminded of its manners." He stepped up and handed the heavy bolt to Cora. Cora took it. The cloth was thick. It was beautiful. "Thank you," Cora whispered. "I expect the shirts by the end of the month," Josiah said, all business once again. He turned to leave. But as he reached the wagon, he stopped. He looked out over the Thornton property. He studied the tree line, then the gentle slope of the valley toward the creek. His eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Thornton," Josiah said, "did your husband own the water rights to that creek?" Cora looked confused. "Yes. The deed covers the water all the way to the old marker." Josiah's jaw tightened. "Have you had visitors lately?" he asked. "Men with surveying equipment?" Cora hesitated. "Last week, I saw 2 men near the ridge. When I walked out with my rifle, they rode off. I thought they were just lost." Josiah shook his head. "Men like that are never lost." He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper from the bank. He walked back and handed it to Cora. "What is this?" Cora asked. "That is the receipt for your bank loan," Josiah said. "It is paid in full. Do not argue with me. Consider it in advance on the sewing." Cora unfolded the paper. She saw the stamp. She saw the numbers. Her hands began to shake. "Mr. Langdon, this is $400. I cannot." "Listen to me carefully," Josiah interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp and urgent. "Arthur Gable was adding fake penalties to your loan to force a default. He wants this farm." Cora stared at him, stunned. "The railroad," Josiah explained. "They aren't going around the mountain. They are coming through the valley. Gable knows it. He has been buying up the foreclosed farms quietly." Cora looked toward the creek. A cold dread settled in her stomach. "If they get your land," Josiah said, They control the only fresh water source for the locomotives. Your husband's farm is the key to the entire line. Nellie stepped onto the porch. She looked from her mother to Josiah. Ma, Nellie asked, are they going to take our house? Josiah looked at the little girl. He remembered the laughter in the store. No, Nellie, Josiah said firmly. They are not. He looked back at Cora. Lock your doors tonight, Mrs. Thornton, Josiah said. Arthur Gable just realized he lost his leverage at the bank. Men like him do not give up easily when there is a fortune on the line. He will try something else. That evening, the wind howled down the chimney, but the kitchen felt entirely different. It felt warm. Cora Thornton sat by the iron stove, her scissors cutting through the heavy red flannel. The fabric was beautiful. It yielded to her shears with a soft, expensive sound. Nellie was supposed to be asleep, but she sat up in her small cot near the wall, watching her mother work. The lantern light cast long shadows, but the red cloth seemed to glow. Cora pinned the seams. She worked quickly, her hands remembering the rhythms of a craft she had learned as a girl. She measured by eye. She stitched with a fierce, quiet joy. She was not just making a garment. She was building armor. Ma, Nellie whispered from the shadows. Cora did not look up. You should be sleeping, Nellie. I can't. Try. Is Mr. Langdon going to shoot Mr. Gable? Cora stopped sewing. She rested her hands on the bright fabric. She looked at her daughter. No, Cora said. Good men do not shoot people over money. Grandpa Silas shot people. That was a war. This is a valley. Cora threaded her needle again. Besides, Cora added, a faint, dry smile touching her lips. I suspect Mr. Langdon knows worse things to do to a banker than shoot him. Nellie seemed satisfied with that. She lay back down. The steady pull of the thread soon lulled her to sleep. Cora worked long into the night. By the time the mantel clock struck 3 in the morning, the dress was finished. Cora held it up by the shoulders. It was perfect. The collar was high and neat. The sleeves were full. The hem was perfectly even. She had even used a scrap of leftover black velvet from her sewing box to line the cuffs. It was a dress fit for the granddaughter of a hero. Cora folded it carefully and laid it over the back of the chair. Then, she walked to the window. The moon hung low over the snow-covered pasture. Everything was still, but Josiah's warning echoed in her mind. Men like him do not give up easily. She did not go to bed. She walked to the corner cabinet. She opened the heavy wooden door. She reached past the spare blankets and pulled out her husband's Winchester rifle. It was heavy, but Cora knew how to hold it. She loaded the magazine in the dark. The metallic clicks sounded loud in the quiet house. She sat in the wooden rocking chair facing the window. She laid the rifle across her lap. She waited. An hour passed. The wind died down. Then, the dog barked. It was not a friendly bark. It was a sharp, frantic warning. Cora stood up. She moved to the window, keeping her body behind the wooden frame. She peered through the frosted glass. Down by the creek, near the old stone boundary marker, 2 lanterns swung in the dark. Men were walking on her land. They were not walking toward the house. They were walking toward the stone marker. One of them carried a heavy sledgehammer. The other carried a wooden surveyor's stake. Cora understood instantly. If they destroyed the old stone marker and drove a new stake closer to the house, the creek would legally fall on county land. Arthur Gable would not need to buy her farm. He would just steal the water. Cora did not hesitate. She opened the front door. The freezing air hit her face like a slap. She stepped onto the porch. She raised the heavy rifle and pulled the hammer back. The double click was sharp and clear in the cold night. Step away from the water, Cora shouted. Her voice rang out across the frozen yard. It was not the voice of a tired widow in a mercantile. It was the voice of a woman defending her home. The lantern stopped moving. The 2 men turned toward the house. They were too far away for Cora to see their faces, but she saw the moonlight glint off the metal in their hands. Go back inside, lady, a gruff voice called back. This is county business. This is private land, Cora answered. And you are trespassing. The man with the sledgehammer laughed. It was a dirty, cruel sound. Not anymore, it ain't. The bank says the line was drawn wrong. We're just fixing it. He raised the sledgehammer. He aimed it at the old stone marker her husband had laid with his own hands. Cora aimed the rifle slightly above the man's head. She squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the quiet night. Fire flashed from the barrel. The sound echoed off the ridge, rolling like thunder across the valley. The bullet struck the thick branch of a pine tree just above the men. Snow showered down over their hats. The man dropped the sledgehammer. The other man drew a revolver. "Are you crazy?" the man with the gun yelled. "The next one goes lower," Cora said clearly. Her hands were shaking, but the barrel of the rifle did not waver. The man raised his revolver. He aimed it at the porch. Cora braced herself. Before the man could fire, the sound of heavy hoofbeats tore through the trees. From the shadows of the pine ridge, four riders erupted into the moonlight. They moved fast. They did not carry lanterns. They carried ropes and rifles. At the front of the pack was Josiah Langdon. He rode a massive black gelding. He did not slow down. He drove his horse straight between the two men and the creek, cutting them off from the boundary marker. His ranch foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Amos, rode up behind the men. Amos uncoiled a lariat and tossed it with a lazy flick of his wrist. The rope dropped neatly over the man with the revolver. Amos jerked the rope hard. The man flew backward into the snow, dropping his gun. Josiah reined his horse to a halt. The giant animal snorted, blowing white steam into the freezing air. Josiah looked down at the man who had dropped the sledgehammer. "Pick up your hammer," Josiah said softly. The man stared at him, terrified. He knew who Josiah Langdon was. "I said pick it up." The man fumbled in the snow. He grabbed the handle of the sledgehammer. "Now," Josiah said, pointing toward the road. "Walk back to town. If you stop walking before you reach the bank, Amos will drag you the rest of the way." The man looked at Amos. Amos smiled. It was not a friendly smile. The two men scrambled away, leaving their lanterns behind in the snow. Josiah turned his horse. He rode at a slow walk up to the farmhouse. Cora stood on the porch. The rifle was still in her hands. The barrel was smoking slightly. Josiah looked at the rifle. Then he looked at Cora. "I told you to lock your doors, Mrs. Thornton," Josiah said mildly. "I did," Cora replied. But they were outside. A small smile tugged at the corner of Josiah's mouth. He tipped his hat. Colonel Silas would have been proud of that shot. Cora lowered the rifle. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her feeling tired and cold. "Did you know they were coming?" she asked. "I suspected Arthur Gable was a coward," Josiah said, dismounting. "Cowards always do their dirty work in the dark." He walked up the porch steps. "They were trying to move the marker," Cora said, her voice finally trembling. "If they move it, they take the water." Josiah nodded. "I know. The railroad sent their final surveyor to town yesterday. He files his official report tomorrow morning at the courthouse. Gable needed the marker moved before sunrise." Cora looked at him. "What happens now?" Josiah looked back toward town. "Now, the sun comes up," Josiah said, "and we go see the banker." Morning broke clear and bright. The sky was a hard, pale blue. The mercantile was already busy. The townspeople were buying their morning coffee and fresh bread. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Croft were there again, standing near the stove, gossiping about the upcoming winter social. They did not know what had happened in the dark. Down the street, the bank opened its doors. Arthur Gable sat at his desk, drinking hot tea. He looked nervous. He kept glancing out the front window, waiting for his hired men to return with the news that the marker had been moved. Instead, he saw a heavy wagon rolling down Main Street. Josiah Langdon was driving. Beside him sat Cora Thornton. Behind them, riding two abreast, were 6 cowboys from the Broken Ridge Ranch. They looked hard, tired, and completely uncompromising. The wagon stopped in front of the bank. The town grew quiet. People stepped out of the mercantile. The blacksmith stopped hammering. Something was happening, and everybody knew it. Josiah climbed down. He helped Cora step off the wagon. Then, from the back of the wagon, Nellie stood up. Josiah reached up and gently lifted the little girl to the ground. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Nellie was not wearing the frayed, oversized gray wool. She was wearing a brand new dress of deep, brilliant red flannel. The velvet cuffs caught the morning sun. The high collar made her sit perfectly straight. The dress fit her perfectly. She looked warm. She looked proud. She looked like a little girl who belonged exactly where she stood. Mrs. Gable, standing on the boardwalk outside the store, dropped her purse. She recognized the fabric immediately. Nellie held her mother's hand. She did not look at the ground anymore. She looked straight ahead. Josiah stood beside them. "Are you ready, Mrs. Thornton?" Josiah asked. "Yes," Cora said. They walked up the steps and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the bank. Arthur Gable stood up from his desk. His face was the color of old parchment. He looked at the 6 hardened ranch hands standing just inside his doors. He looked at Cora's steady gaze. Finally, he looked at Josiah Langdon. "Mr. Langdon," Gable said. His voice was thin. It squeaked slightly on the second syllable. "What is the meaning of this? You cannot bring armed men into a bank." "They are not armed," Josiah said smoothly. He gestured to the cowboys. They opened their coats. Not a single man wore a gun belt. "They are witnesses," Josiah continued. "And they have a story to tell." Gable swallowed hard. He looked around the lobby. Several townspeople had followed them inside. The room was crowded. "I have no time for stories," Gable said, adjusting his spectacles with a trembling hand. "I am running a business." Josiah stepped forward. He placed his large hands on the edge of the banker's desk. "You were running a business," Josiah corrected. "Now, you are running out of time." Josiah reached into his coat. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out and laid it flat on the mahogany desk. Gable looked down. It was a confession. It was signed by the two men who had been on Cora's property the night before. They were quite eager to talk, Josiah said softly, especially after Amos offered them a long walk in the snow. Gable's eyes darted toward the door. "This proves nothing. Men will sign anything if they are frightened. The railroad needs that water. If Mrs. Thornton will not sell, the county will simply seize the land for the public good. The railroad is a powerful entity, Mr. Langdon. Even you cannot fight progress." Josiah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Arthur," Josiah said, "who do you think is paying for the new tracks?" The room went entirely silent. Gable stared. "What?" "The Northern Line," Josiah said calmly. "It is a very expensive project. The steel comes from Pennsylvania. The timber comes from Oregon. The money comes from me." Gable sank slowly back into his leather chair. The twist struck the banker like a physical blow. Josiah Langdon was not just a cattleman. He was the primary shareholder of the incoming railroad. Gable had spent months trying to steal land for a company that Josiah already owned. "You didn't know," Josiah said, his voice carrying a note of genuine pity. "You thought you were being clever. You thought you could force a widow out of her home, buy the land cheap, and sell it to the railroad at a premium. But you were trying to sell my own water back to me." Cora stood perfectly still. She had not known this either. Josiah reached into his coat one last time. He pulled out a crisp, heavy document bearing a golden legal seal. He did not hand it to Gable. He turned and handed it to Cora. "Mrs. Thornton," Josiah said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "This is a 10-year lease agreement. The Northern Line would like to pay you $600 a year for the right to run a water pipe from your creek to our new station." Cora took the paper. Her hands shook. $600 a year was a fortune. It was more than enough to fix the farm, buy a new herd, and send Nellie to the finest school in the state. "Mr. Langdon," Cora whispered. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Josiah replied. Cora smiled. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. "Yes." Josiah turned back to the desk. He looked down at Arthur Gable. "As for you, Arthur," Josiah said, "I am withdrawing all Broken Ridge funds from this institution. Every penny, unless you resign your position and leave Clearwater by sundown." Gable looked around the room. He looked for a friendly face. He found none. The townspeople were staring at him with undisguised disgust. Even the storekeeper, Mr. Higgins, shook his head and turned his back. Gable was ruined. He had gambled his reputation on a cruel scheme, and he had lost everything. Josiah offered his arm to Cora. "Shall we, Mrs. Thornton?" Cora took his arm. "We shall." They turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for them. Near the door stood Mrs. Harriet Gable. She had rushed over from the mercantile when the crowd formed. She had heard everything. Her face was pale. The haughty, cruel sneer was completely gone, replaced by the crushing realization that her husband was disgraced and their wealth was a sudden illusion. She looked at Cora. Then, her eyes dropped to Nellie. Nellie stood tall in her beautiful, bright red flannel dress. The velvet cuffs brushed against her sides. She looked like a portrait of dignity. Mrs. Gable opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had nothing left to say. Nellie did not gloat. She did not laugh. She remembered her mother's lesson about a strong spine. She simply looked at Mrs. Gable, offered a polite, practiced nod, and walked out the door into the bright winter sunlight. By spring, the snow melted from the valley. The railroad began laying tracks across the ridge. True to his word, Josiah Langdon's men laid the water pipe carefully, ensuring Cora's pastures remained pristine. Arthur and Harriet Gable left town before the first thaw. They moved back east, leaving their large house empty. No one missed them. Cora kept her farm. She hired 2 men to repair the porch and fix the roof. But she also kept sewing. She made the winter shirts for Josiah's men, refusing to accept any extra payment for them. It was a matter of pride. Josiah Langdon visited often. He would sit on the repaired porch, drinking hot coffee while Eliza and Nellie ran through the tall spring grass. He never spoke of the debt. He never brought up the bank. They simply sat together, 2 people who understood the value of quiet strength. Years later, Nellie Thornton would grow into a fine, educated young woman. She would travel to the city. She would wear silk and lace. She would never want for anything again. But she never forgot the cold afternoon in the mercantile. She never forgot the sound of cruel laughter. And she never forgot the tall cowboy who stood in the shadows and refused to let the cruelty stand. When Nellie packed her trunk to leave for college, she brought only a few sentimental things. She brought her grandfather's faded parchment. She brought a photograph of her mother. And, folded neatly at the very bottom of her trunk, she kept a small, frayed scrap of gray wool. She kept it to remember a simple truth. And that brings Nellie's story to a close. I hope this trip back to 1883 gave you a chance to step out of your everyday routine and just drift into a tale of quiet dignity. I'd love to know how you tuned in today. Were you sipping some hot coffee, relaxing on the porch, or winding down for a cozy evening? Drop a comment below. I really do read every single one. Tell me, did you see Josiah's brilliant railroad twist coming at the bank? Also, let me know what country you're watching from. Hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thank you for spending this time with me.